So today we will discuss on SQL Server constraints. So what
Yeah.
are constraints, right? So when we create a table, we define some constraints on few of the columns, right? So that we make sure like we don't get any unwanted data into those columns. So this will help us to ensure the accuracy and reliability of the data. Like for example, you have an employee table and you have a gender column in that, right? So the gender can be male or female or others, right? So you cannot put your name in the gender column. That's a inaccurate data, right? So to prevent this kind of occurrences to happen, we can add constraints in database tables, right? So basically it will help us to ensure data quality, right? And data will be accurate and reliable. So any end user who will be using those tables or those columns for their reporting purpose, they will not see any junk data. So this is just to ensure data quality, and we can create constraints on single or multiple columns of any tables, right? And constraints maintain the data integrity and accuracy in the table. So the data integrity part will come when we will discuss the constraints like primary key and foreign key, because those are interrelated. So there is an integrity between them, and we will see that going ahead, right? So now we talked about constraints. We know we can add constraints in the column of any tables, right? So there are two ways in which we can add the constraints. First is the column type constraints. So what happens in this case? While you create the table definition, basically the DDL command, in the DDL itself, you will specify the constraint. For example, if you see this particular case, they are creating a table my constraint, and there are column IDD, IID, and salary. So ID column and salary column. So what they did a not null constraint on the ID column, and they did a check constraint on the salary column, and they did all this while they defined the table structure itself. So this is called table type constraints. So the name is confusing. It should not be column. It should be table. I'll change that later. And then the second is the column type constraints, right? So what happens in the columns time constraints? We can alter the table at any given point of time. And then if a particular column doesn't have any constraint, you can add a constraint at that point of time by using the alter table statement. So both of this happens at the as a DDL command, right? So we saw in the first session, like there are two DDL commands: create, alter, drop, and truncate was one of them. 4 DDL commands, right? So we can use create table and alter table to assign any constraints to the column in the tables. Clear till this point?
Yes.
Okay. So coming to the type of constraints, we have 6 type of constraints. The first is not null constraint. So what does not null constraint does? It will ensure like the column on which this constraint is applied, we cannot insert null values in those columns. Okay. So then comes the check constraint. Check constraint will check for the specific condition which has been mentioned there. And if the condition is satisfied, it will insert the record in that column. If not, it will not allow you to insert the data inside the column. For example, if you say this check constraint example, we are checking the age should be greater than 50. So if you insert any record in this my constraint table with age less than 50, that record will not get inserted. It will throw us an error message saying the constraint is getting violated. The age is not more than 50. Right? That is what check constraint does. The next constraint is the default constraint. What will default constraint do? For example, like we have a gender column, right? So it can have male, female, or by default others option. So while inserting the record in the table, we forgot to mention the gender, right? We did not give male or female, right? So in that case, the default constraint can be applied on gender column, saying like if you don't see any values, if we don't provide male or female, default it to other. So that kind of implementation we can do using the default constraint. So then comes the unique constraint. The unique constraint, what it will do? It will ensure the records for this particular column on which this constraint is applied are all unique. So there should not be any duplicate entries, right? Then comes the primary key constraint. It's again the same thing. it again ensures like the column on which is created as a primary key does not have any duplicates and it remains unique throughout the table. So there is a difference between primary key constraint and unique constraint. That is, like, unique constraint will allow you to insert the null values. The primary key constraint will not allow you to insert null values. That's the only difference among these two. So otherwise both are same. And in a table, you can only have one primary key, but you can have multiple unique keys. So there can be multiple unique constraints in a table, but primary key can only be one in any table, and that can be a single column or it can be a combination of columns, but it will be only one primary key for one table. So then comes the foreign key. The foreign key constraint is nothing but it references the primary key from any other table into the current table in which it is created as a foreign key. So there is a referential integrity that gets created here. So any column which you mention as foreign key in table A, for example, and you are referencing the primary key from table B, it means that there is an integrity and these two tables are related. So that's where this particular part come into picture, data integrity. So this was on a high level of how many type of constraints we have in SQL Server.